So the last Mishnah in Masechet Ta'anit surprises us with the following line. It says, Amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, Lo hayu yamim tovim leYisrael kechamisha asar b'av ucheyom kippurim. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, there were no more joyous days for the Jewish people than the 15th of Av, that's Tu B'Av, and Yom Kippur. So the two happiest days in the Jewish calendar, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, are a fast day, Yom Kippur, and a holiday that most Jews have never even heard of or know very little about, Tu B'Av. So it's a really surprising Mishnah. And so our focus tonight will be to try to dig into what is this mysterious holiday of Tu B'Av, the 15th day of Av, a day that's described in this Mishnah as tied for first as the happiest day in the Jewish calendar. So here's the plan. We're going to look at the origins of Tu B'Av, and then we'll look at the practical laws, the halachot of Tu B'Av, and then finally we'll talk a little bit about kind of a modern rediscovery and rebirth of this happy day and some thoughts about what that might mean for all of our lives. Okay, so let's start with the history and the sources. So like so many Jewish holidays, Tu B'Av is rooted in, on the one hand, the natural cycle of the year, the natural calendar, and also, on the other hand, the historical calendar of Jewish history. And our holidays always seem to work this way, right? They seem to have these dual imagery of nature, the natural cycle of the year, and history, Jewish history. So for example, Pesach, of course, is Chag HaAviv, the holiday of the spring. That's the natural. And then it's also Zman Cherutenu, that's the historical. All the regalim work that way. And some of you might recall that even holidays that it's not always obvious what the natural connection are, like for example, Hanukkah, in one of the Hanukkah shiurim, we also kind of talked a little bit about how there's a natural calendar in that as well. Anyways, the bottom line is that our holidays always seem to take something universal about the way the world turns, the seasons, the harvest cycle, and then layers on top of that a special meaning that's based in our history, in particular, in Jewish history. And that seems to be the case for Tu B'Av as well. So we're going to start by looking at some of the universal, you might say, that some of the more natural cycle related aspects of Tu B'Av, and then we'll get to the history. The historical layer, you could say. Okay, so here's how the Mishnah in Ta'anit, that last Mishnah in Ta'anit, describes the way that Tu B'Av was once celebrated. The Mishnah says that on this day, the daughters of Jerusalem would go out and dance in the vineyards. And it talks all about this kind of ceremony, you might call it, of them dancing around, dressed in white. It was a shidduch time, apparently. But anyways, they're described as dancing around in this way in the vineyards. And it's interesting. I was recently talking to a rabbi who was in town from Israel. And he told me that he never understood Tu B'Av until he started growing his own grapes in his own garden, his own vineyard in Israel. And only then did he see with his own eyes that Tu B'Av, it turns out, is the time of year when grapes begin to ripen in Eretz Yisrael. That's what he told me. He says, for this reason, the Mishnah's description of this kind of vineyard-related celebration made more sense to him suddenly when he himself was planting a vineyard. And so some have suggested that maybe this has a connection to the ripening of the grapes, again, in the way that Pesach relates to the spring, Shavuot to the harvest, Sukkot to the ingathering. Maybe there's a connection to kind of the new grapes of the season. And interestingly, doesn't prove one way or the other, but it is notable that the Qumran community, the sect of Jews that we know of from the Dead Sea Scrolls, had a holiday around this time of year, not exactly the 15th of Av, but the 3rd of Av, that they called the Festival of New Wine. Anyways, okay, there's something wine related going on here. That's one potential natural aspect. Here's another natural aspect. If you look at Megillat Ta'anit, Megillat Ta'anit, not Masechet Ta'anit, not the Mishnah Ta'anit, but Megillat Ta'anit. That's a book that we've actually referred to a number of times in the Shiurim, because if you'll recall, Megillat Ta'anit is a list of holidays that were celebrated during Beit Sheni, during the Second Temple times. So it's kind of a funny name. It's called Megillat Ta'anit, the scroll or the book of fasts, but it's actually the days on which you're not allowed to fast because those are holidays. Most of those holidays we no longer keep. Okay, but it's always interesting to look back and say what were the holidays that were kept during the Second Temple times, during Beit Sheni, on different days of the year. So Megillat Ta'anit has an entry for the 15th of Av. But the day mentioned Megillat Ta'anit isn't the Tu B'Av that we know of from the Mishnah. It doesn't seem to be a vineyard. It doesn't say anything about the vineyards and the dancing. Instead, Megillat Ta'anit mentions a different holiday on the 15th of Av called Zman Atzei Kohanim, the day of the priestly wood offering, presumably. It actually explains what that's about. The day of the wood offering. That apparently was the time of year when people would put away their axes after the wood cutting season came to an end. The wood was kind of good for chopping until around this time, and then if you waited any longer, it would get dried out and not be as good. So this was the end of the wood cutting season, and in fact, the Gemara in Ta'anit also gives the same explanation of when the Gemara in Ta'anit lists a range of reasons for Tu B'Av, and we'll go through, most of those are historically based, but it does give one that is related to the natural cycle, and it is this end of wood cutting season aspect of the holiday. Okay, and also, again, if you were just kind of looking to other sources, not our kind of traditional Jewish sources, but just were curious whether this shows up in any other Jewish sources of the time, it turns out that Josephus, who's the Jewish historian of the late Second Temple period, he mentions a feast of wood carrying that he said took place on the 14th of Av. Okay, again, maybe neither here nor there, but seems to have a lot of connectivity to this this wood cutting, end of wood cutting season holiday in Megillat Ta'anit, and also mentioned as one of the reasons in the Gemara in Ta'anit. Okay, so anyways, for a number of, this aspect of the 15th of Av, of Tu B'Av being related to the tree cycle, that actually is halacha l'maisa. That actually does continue on. That concept comes to us. So for example, the Shulchan Aruch says that the 15th of Av is you could call it the cutoff date for determining the age of a tree for the purpose of Orla. Orla is the first 3 years of the life of a tree, and you don't eat its fruit. Anyways, Tu B'Av is a relevant date for that halacha. Okay, so those are some, let's say, natural cycle related aspects of this date of Tu B'Av. But with all that said, the Gemara in Ta'anit, so remember the Mishnah in Ta'anit said Tu B'Av is this one of the 2 happiest days in the calendar. When the Gemara then starts to discuss what is this day of Tu B'Av and why is it so special? And a similar discussion comes up also in Masechet Bava Batra. So there are 5 other, in addition to that kind of wood chopping aspect of the holiday, the Gemara brings 5 other explanations for the holiday. And those 5 other explanations have nothing to do with the natural cycle. Instead, they're reasons having to do with Jewish history. So 5 different historical events that the Gemara ties to the date of Tu B'Av to explain why it was a happy day. And we'll go through them. We'll go through those 5 historical explanations. But you'll see, I think you'll notice pretty quickly that there is a common theme as you go through the list. And we'll see that each of these historical aspects of the holiday shares in the theme of it being a time when a sad period ends and we start to move forward. Okay, so let's go through all five, but I think you'll see that that is the theme of all five. So the first, the Gemara says that this is the day on which the people from different tribes were again allowed to intermarry one with each other, marriages between the tribes, after a temporary restriction in the time of the daughters of Salafhad. And that's a story actually we just read in the last couple of Parshiot, right around this time of year from the book of Bamidbar. That whole thing had to do with these daughters who they're worried about, are they going to be able to get their inheritance in the land of Israel? And there's a solution to their problem, but it involves them marrying within their tribe. Anyways, the concept is that for a while, marriages between the tribes had a restriction on it, and that rule was loosened, and that was a happy day. That was a cause for celebration. Okay. A reason for the holiday dating back as early as the Torah itself. Okay, here's a second reason that the Gemara gives. The Gemara says Tu B'Av was the day when the tribe of Binyamin was allowed to rejoin the nation and start marrying in, again, kind of marrying in with the rest of Klal Yisrael. That relates to the awful story of Pilegesh Begiva in the book of Shoftim. And I won't go through all the details of that, but you'll recall that that's a very awful story, and so bad that where it heads is that the other tribes of Bnei Israel consider wiping out the tribe of Binyamin entirely. And that includes not allowing anyone to marry with them. And this holiday, according to the Gemara, marks the day when Binyamin, the tribe of Binyamin, was welcomed back into the fold. Okay, so that's explanation number two. Explanation number three, the Gemara says, the Tu B'Av is the day when the generation of the desert stopped dying after the sin of the spies. Right? After the sin of the spies, they lie down and dig their own graves and expect to die every year. And Tu B'Av is the day when that stopped. Okay, so that's number three. Number four, the Gemara says this was the day when the border guards that the evil king Yeravam ben Nevat put at the border between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Yehuda. Yeravam ben Nevat, he's the king of the north, right, of the kingdom of Israel, and he says, I'm not going to allow anyone from my kingdom to go south to the kingdom of Yehuda to visit the Beit HaMikdash. Says no one from the northern kingdom is allowed to go south. No one can go to the Beit HaMikdash. And he puts border guards to make sure that nobody does that. And apparently, the Gemara is telling us that there was a date when those border guards were finally removed so that people could once again go south and visit the Beit HaMikdash. And that date, when the border guards were taken away, was Tu B'Av. Okay, and here's the fifth, final reason that the Gemara gives, fifth historical reason that the Gemara gives. It says that later, all those so far are from Tanakh, right? But later, post Tanakh, the Gemara says that Tu B'Av is the day when the dead of Beitar, that was in the times of Bar Kokhba, this kind of tragic final battle, final stand of Bar Kokhba. Tu B'Av, the Gemara says, is the day when the dead of that massacre by the Romans to finally be buried, after the Romans had decreed that the corpses should lie unburied on the ground for some period of time. Finally, when they were allowed to be buried, that was Tu B'Av. Okay, what's going on here? What is going on here with this list, this series of historical events? So it's worth reminding ourselves that the Mishnah does the exact same thing when the Mishnah explains Tisha B'Av and Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz, those two sad days. The Mishnah similarly gives a list of a series of events across Jewish history leading up almost to the times of the Mishnah itself. Okay, it gives a series of historical explanations of why Tisha B'Av is Tisha B'Av and why Shiva Asar B'Tammuz is a sad day. basically, the Mishnah says that on each of those days, there were a series of tragic events that happened over and over through Jewish history, a series of catastrophes on those days. Okay, and now the Mishnah, or rather the Gemara, is doing something very similar with the holiday of Tu B'Av. It's giving a series of historical reasons why this day is the day of, you could say, consolation or the moving forward after a tragedy has happened. Because each of those cases that we went through was there was something horrible that happened and it finally got better at Tu B'Av. So the Gemara is doing something kind of in the same way as the Mishnah for Tisha B'Av and Shivasa B'Tammuz had said, these are sad days because of a series of historical events going all the way back and almost to our day. Similarly, the Gemara now is saying Tu B'Av is a happy day because it's a moving forward. And if you think about it, at this time of year, what we do after Tisha B'Av is we move on to Shabbat Nachamu, right? That is the first Shabbat after Tisha B'Av. On Shabbat Nachamu, we start reading the 7 Haftarot of consolation, the Shiva de Nechemta, after the tragedy of Tisha B'Av. We also, in the way that we kind of do our davening, we have a similar theme of Tisha B'Av ends, and we have a coming, almost like a getting out of Shiva, like a moving forward after the tragic event. That's what we do with Shabbat Nachamu. The Gemara seems to be explaining Tu B'Av in a similar light. It's a holiday of consolation and restoration after this sad period of the 3 weeks that culminates in Tisha B'Av. We finally allow ourselves to turn the corner, and that is a reason to celebrate. And that's what makes Tu B'Av one of the happiest days in the calendar. And it also helps explain what the Gemara might have meant when it said that the 2 happiest days in the Jewish calendar are Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av, because here's the way that the Gemara comments on that. It says Bishlama Yom Kippurim. It says obviously Yom Kippur is a happy day, mishum de'it beislicha u'mechila, because that's a day of forgiveness. And it says that is Yom Shenitnu Bo Luchot Achronot. That is the day when we were given the second Luchot, the second set of tablets, after we were forgiven after the sin of the golden calf. So the Gemara is saying, of course Yom Kippur is a happy day because it's fundamentally a day of second chances and restoration and moving forward after something that had gone horribly wrong. So too, the holiday of Tu B'Av. It's a joyous day because it's also a holiday of second chances, of moving forward after tragedy. Okay, so in that sense, the holiday of Tu B'Av, I would say, hopefully is especially meaningful for us this year, because we too, right now, are hopefully pulling ourselves out of a period that's been really, really tough. And we get to start looking forward to better days ahead, please God. Okay, so that was kind of like section 1. Section 1 was looking at the holiday, something about its origins, the way that we know about it from different sources, the natural aspects and the historical aspects as explained to us by the Gemara. Okay, now let's talk about the actual celebration of Tu B'Av. What do? We saw that the Mishnah in Ta'anit made this sound like a very exciting holiday, right? With all the women, the young women dancing in white in the vineyards. Sounds like a pretty exciting holiday. We don't do any of that. That way of celebrating Tu B'Av has not survived the generations. If you dig through the halachic, literature, let's say, you find that there's very limited scope to the celebration of Tu B'Av. Of course, in our davening, there's no hallel, there's no mitzvot of the day. It's a holiday, but there's not that much that we do about it these days. There is one change in the davening. We don't say tachanun on Tu B'Av. That usually gets people excited. No tachanun. And we don't say tachanun the mincha before either. So in that sense, the halacha treats Tu B'Av like like a real holiday, right? When we talk about a real holiday, we also don't say Tachanun. It's not just like, there's a bris or something, and we don't, it's a happy time, and we have a Suda mitzvah or something that would make us not say Tachanun just then. It's more than that. It's like kind of like a holiday, and we also don't say Mincha the day before. Okay. But anyways, for the most part, this holiday that the Mishnah describes as one of the happiest days in the Jewish calendar has very little halacha attached to it that's come forward to us. Maybe it's too strong to say that it fell out of practice entirely for a long time, but it hasn't until recently. It has not been, other than the Gemara telling us that it's an amazing, amazing day, it has not been a really important day in the Jewish calendar until recently. Because amazingly, in our day, in contemporary Israel, Tu B'Av has taken on a whole new significance. So let's make that kind of the last part of our shiur tonight, the modern reemergence of the holiday of Tu B'Av. So in modern day Israel, Tu B'Av has gotten kind of a new lease on life. It's now called, people refer to it as Chag HaAhava, the Day of Love. It's become something like a midsummer love festival, you could say. Now, if you want to be grumpier about it, you might look at it and say, well, that's just like an Israeli Valentine's Day. And in some sense, that is how it's enjoyed. But I think it's too harsh to say that it's just Israeli Valentine's Day. If Israelis wanted to celebrate Valentine's Day, they could do that on February 14th. So instead, Israelis decided to take an old Jewish tradition and they ran with it and they updated it, you could say, for modern times. So in a sense, the holiday of Tu B'Av is kind of a metaphor for something that's going on in Israel today. It's something that happened where, without anybody telling anyone to do this, secular Israelis, just Israelis, kind of in general, took on a religious tradition, something old, something that had gone somewhat dormant, and ran with it. Now, again, this is not out of nowhere to think of this as a day of love. Tu B'Av has always been a prime day for getting married. It's right after the period of the 3 weeks ends, and we can finally start having weddings again. And there's also an interesting halacha. So I mentioned there are very few halachot of the day, but one of them is that a bride and groom do not fast if their wedding, or are not supposed to fast if their wedding falls on Tu B'Av. So that's interesting. Again, there's all these connections to marriage related to this day. And even in those historical connections to the day, we saw that a number of them were about marriages of the tribes being reinstated again. And the Mishnah's description of the maidens dancing in the vineyards looking for shidduchim. So Tu B'Av is a day that's been associated with love for a long time, but modern Israelis definitely took that theme and supercharged it. So, okay, I'll just kind of end with this. Maybe especially this year, that gives us an extra theme that we can think about and relate to on Tu B'Av of this year. A day that has the potential to be one of the happiest days on the Jewish calendar, and a holiday of moving forward after tragedy, after the 3 weeks, after Tisha B'Av, maybe even after things that in more contemporary times we've been going through. If the reason for the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash was sinat chinam, baseless hatred, then perhaps the holiday of love, Yom HaAhava, this day that comes less than a week after Tisha B'Av, maybe this year should be Yom HaAhava in the sense of Yom Ahavat Chinam, a day of unbounded love, one for each other. And that maybe this year, especially, we can take an old holiday that's been resurrected in modern times and use this Yom HaAhava as a day of Yom Ahavat Yisrael, which is something that we could all use a lot more of. Okay, so I'll leave off with that.